The 394 is completely on the back burner until I get an ignition for it. And there's no sign of spark on that one now. It had a variety of things wrong with it, and I'm finding more as we get further into it. Cases are pretty messed up. The handle's pretty messed up. Basically, it was just a worn out old saw. Farbertech came to the rescue for a reasonably priced filter and a reasonably priced replacement side cover I got through Duke's. And I'm telling you, the aftermarket has a place, especially if you're into old vintage saws. But look at the case. All this is broke out. That's all gone right there. It's missing a lot of the parts of the case there. But this is what happens when you take an old worn out saw and try to bring it back to life, is you find stuff like that, especially if it was a saw that spent its life, you know, serving a logger. You know, by the time they're done with it, it's pretty much beat. We'll get something out of it just because it's fun, right? But to expect to be able to turn this into a solid saw that a person could put back into service would not be really realistic. And I guess that begs the question, is it better to start with the bones of an old saw like this if you want to build a work saw for cheap, you know, or do you start with the Husqvarna and then work your way back into OEM quality parts like top ends and some of the other stuff? And I think this exercise over the next year, because I have the G395, I think that's going to demonstrate pretty clearly the difference in approaches. You know, by the time you get a new saw, these things are like $1,400. The Husqvarna is like $400 delivered to your door plus a piston. Now I started with this one. You might find a carcass for like $150, but I've already got a top end, you know, into it, and I'm very quickly getting to that $400 mark that you'd start with the Husqvarna. You know what I'm saying? So what else is on the bench for today? One thing I don't have is my camera. I have no idea where it is. So this is all going to be done with the phone. And Bob's coming up tomorrow. And I put a little time into one of the old Jonsereds, the 455. Definitely going to get some time on that saw, the 455. And I found a spur that I believe is going to work on this one right here. And found it on eBay. It's like 20 bucks. I don't know if it has a part number on it or not. Oh, there you go. HU400 ATN. It's a nice looking part. But with this series of saw, there was two basic crankshafts. I've mentioned that before. But when you get into the really early ones like this one right here, this is a 1978 version. A lot of them had that half 13 thread on the clutch. It had a slightly different diameter as well. So you've got to match up the spur and drum with the right size bearing, and then the right sized prongs right there, the 4 prongs, which stick into the worm gear for the oil pump. Got to match it all up or it's not going to work. Yeah, it's a little bit much, but it's what I got. I've done so much with this wrench. And it's also not recommended to zing this clutch off the way I'm going to do it, but you know, it's how we roll here. I would say that the least amount of time with an impact wrench on one of those cranks is the better. So either be gentle or be prepared to pay for the results. So I'm going to slip that one on there, put the camera down for a second. You know, sometimes I get a little annoyed at all the BS you hear online. And one of the things you hear about these Oregon Versacuts is that somehow they've got a softer material. That means whoever's saying that has never tried to break the burr on these things. You can't even touch it with a file unless it's like brand spanking new. Those side rails there are hard. You know, that's why it wears as good as it does. Mine's worn pretty well. But typically I can hit it with a grinder. Not a recommended way. I've got a belt sander at the main shop that I use to touch them up with, and that'll touch them, you know, with the abrasive. But they're hard. They last. You know, for the kind of money you spend on these things, they're lightweight, and I'm sure that there's anomalies. One guy will get a sample of one and not like it, and that'll cast a spell across his feelings on everything. But I've got a bunch of them, and I've run a bunch of them, and I've worn out a couple of them. And the one thing I can tell you is they wear is long, if not longer, than anything else I've ever had, including the Zumeras. And the difference is cost. I mean, this thing here, I got this at Boonville, the farm show up there, for like $50 because nobody's buying them. Good for me. I hope you hate them. You know what I'm saying? I'll get more of them because I think they're a great bar for the money, especially for a hobby type where you're looking for lightweight. But I've had a couple of the local pros run them, and they complain that they wish they could replace the tip. But then I've asked them, well, have you ever had to replace the tip on one? They say no. They just like the idea that they might have to someday. But it's just people, you know. Let me put it on the saw and see if I can get it fired up. It's oiling really good, so I think it means we have a chainsaw here. But I like this saw here. You think about it. It's really a 272 top end on an old 61. And the reason why I'm not getting the 13.5 out of it like you would out of a 272 is because it's got the smaller carburetor. So at some point in time, I'm going to bring the carburetor up to the same spec as a true 272. And this will be a ripping saw. Now, I had built this saw, you know, a long time ago. And, I mean, I don't know, 2008 or 9, that time period. And the reason I did it was getting through that whole 200 series, the 61s through 272s. Bob and I got into those for a while. And I was just trying to prove that with a little bit of ingenuity that you can mix and match all the way up and down that product line that Husqvarna had in the 70s, 80s, into the 90s, you know. It's funny because I see the 266s, they get a lot of press because guys discovered them. They're a good running saw, kind of like the Jonsered 630s. They're a bit of a sleeper. But they had a smaller intake block than the 268 and 272. So while the 266 has got a lot of following right now, and they're legitimately a cool saw, if you're really into performance, you need that larger intake boot that you get on the 268, 272 series. So you just watch. A little over time, you know, you'll see the guys who have been diving into the 266s discover that little nuance about that series, and they'll yet again get another boost in performance as they get to a little bit larger intake block, you know, and then allows them to flow a little bit more gas and air and burn more gas and air. That means more power. I guess while I'm on that subject, before I forget, and I might decide to go back and dig through the parts bin to show off some of the different parts. The 272 had a 52 millimeter top end, right? The 268 had a 50 millimeter top end. Now, The reason why that's interesting is because one of the hop-ups that we had done in the past was the 52 millimeter big bore kits for the 372 series. You could use a 272 piston and cut a pop-up into it and get a lot more compression. And the reason is the wrist pin location relative to the crown is different on the 268, 272 than the 372. So there's a little more distance between the center line of the wrist pin on a 272 to the crown than there is between the wrist pin and the crown of a 372 piston. So when you have a cylinder of the same 50 or 52 millimeter bore on the 372 chassis, when you stuff one of these little pistons in there, it's going to go up and wrap the combustion chamber unless you either put gaskets in the, unless you put gaskets underneath the cylinder or you cut a pop-up. I used to cut a pop-up and add a gasket, and that's what I would do for a hop-up. I did a video once, I think it was a 268, where I did a pop-up. That thing, that 268 piston, I had cut a pop-up in and put in a 372 top end, was about the easiest to start saw I had ever built. Now, I really don't understand why, but I suspect it has to do with the shape of the piston below the crown, you know, around the wrist pin and the skirts and stuff like that. For whatever reason, it was just an easy starting thing. But that brings up another point, and this is another nuance. When Husky went from the 272 and 268 series, the 372, one of the things they did on the 372 versus the 272 was obviously the quad port. There was a lot more transfer area, and it was a lot more control going into the combustion chamber with the quad port design they had on the 372 cylinders. But they also increased the stroke a little bit on the 372 over the 272. So you're going to say, okay, what's that mean? And conventional logic says, oh my God, you increased the stroke. You might limit the RPM some. Well, not on a saw like this, you don't. You know, they're already short strokes. So adding a little bit to the stroke on a 372 on a really over square design is not going to really do much from an RPM capabilities, and it obviously didn't, because a 372 can rev out as much or more than a 272. The next thing people are going to say is, oh, okay, a longer stroke means more torque. Maybe, yeah, because the crank pin relative to the center line of the crank is a little bit larger. So yeah, theoretically you have that little moment arm adding a little bit more leverage on the crank from the piston. So yeah, possibly you might go there. But that's really not the big thing you get. The big thing you get is the larger transfer cross-sectional area on the 372, and you got to add the ability to pump the gas and air mix through it. When you get a longer stroke motor on one of these things, the delta in the volume of the crankcase as the piston goes up and down is a little bit more. So it's adding a little bit more pumping capability to take advantage of those larger ports. And that's as much an issue as anything else in that design change. They had to add a little bit of primary compression to be able to move all that gas and air up the transfer ports in order to make that thing sing. So a lot of that stuff, you know, kind of adds up. The engineers do that. That's what they do for a living. But because of that, that's why you have the subtle differences in the piston design, right? And it's also why a 372 runs quite a bit better than a 272, just simply because they added cross-sectional area to the transfer ports, which is a sure way of getting more high RPM power. And they added the ability by adding a little more stroke to pump that gas and air up those transfers. And of course, a few other things they did was a little upgraded anti-vibe. We're not going to get into that. And of course, going from a block to a rubber boot, and that isolates the carburetor from the cylinder, so the heat doesn't transfer out to the carburetor quite as easily as it did on the 272 series, stuff like that. But those little things add up, my friends. And yeah, you can take a 272 or a 268 and crank it up where it runs as good as a 372. But if you put the same effort into the 372 chassis, guess what? You're gonna yet again pull ahead. It's just the way it is. So just a different design, more area to work with in the transfers, a little more sophisticated transfer port design. You know, all that stuff adds up. There's more power potential in a 372 chassis than there is in the 268 272. But I still love my 61 272. It isn't about ultimate power, it's about fun. And this is a cool saw. It's different and it runs really, really well. It's not going to beat a stock 372, but it's going to get close, you know what I'm saying? And it's something that I built. And that adds a lot of you know, value to it from my perspective. But anyway. So I actually found the camera finally. And I'm trying to get myself kind of set up for tomorrow. Bob's going to show up, and I wanted to pretty much keep it as a vintage day. And saws I have in the truck are, well, that one fits the bill, right? The 2175 really doesn't, and the blue one absolutely does not. So I went back to the shop and I pulled these out. Now, you've seen the L77 run enough, I don't really have to do that. It's pretty much a almost production ready saw, in the sense that it's a vintage saw that runs and runs well for a long period of time if I ask it to, right? I actually did a couple of days of logging with it last year. Of course, an old man like that, you don't beat on it so much, but it's actually a solid saw right there. Even though it looks a little bit on the ratty side, it works, you know. It cuts wood. It's not that heavy. And we've talked about it a lot, so it's not going to be on the menu for today or tomorrow. I want to see if that one restarts. We ran this last week a little bit. Went out in the woods and cut some wood with it. Did pretty much what it always does. Runs. Got it all dirty. But that's what happens when you work a chainsaw. So that's a 70E. Got a little bit of gas in it. None of these chains are particularly sharp, so I'm going to run them, but don't see this as a race. Just see this as they run and get an idea of what kind of noise they make. This one here, I put a different spur on it. And I'm kind of curious to see how that works. It should run a little bit better. I ran that last fall, so you saw it before too. This is that model 61 with a 272 top end, but it has the 61 smaller carburetor. So it's not quite a 272, but it's a lot of fun. You know, that chassis was actually manufactured in 1978. Now this is new. You haven't seen this one run. Neither have I. That one you did, but you don't remember because it was 10 years ago, and I'm not even sure I had the channel yet when I was running that saw. How many times do you see a saw start? First pull after been sitting for a day. Certainly not this next saw. Well, I think you can probably tell that this saw right here is not that far off a modern saw. So it's a little bit of a sleeper in this crowd. Now the chain is pretty dull, it needs a sharpening, but even with that chain it'll still rip some chips. See, I choked it to stop it, so it may not restart as easy. Okay, it starts easy. Nicely built saw. It's a little heavy for what it is, but it sure is a nice saw. So let's move on to the next ones. Both this 70E and that 61 272 are like 70 cc class saws. You know, this one here is an earlier design, obviously, but actually the chassis that was built on was sold alongside these in the marketplace. You know, and that's a lot lighter. Those Husqvarnas are very, very light. That saw right there, that 61 272, really doesn't feel that far off a modern saw. It runs that good and is that light. The one thing it doesn't have is the chain brake, which is a very important safety feature. So it's a little bit of a risky saw, but every time I run that, you know, I think about the other saws in that displacement class it would have competed against in the marketplace, like the Home Lights and the Colics. You know, not bagging on them, but they're just not in the same league in terms of performance and the size, weight, the ergonomics, the whole thing. That Husky 61 through 272 series was way ahead of its time. Now, the online crowd has discovered the 266s, and they're cool. I like them. That was a mid-80s saw. The 272 and the 268 were at the top of the evolutionary curve with those. You know, they were top of the food chain. And the biggest difference between the 268 and the 272 versus the older 266 series is the 268 and 272 had a larger intake block, so they could actually flow more gas air, get more RPMs, get more power. But if they start with a 670 or a 268 or a 272, there's more performance potential than the older versions just because of the way the intakes work. I found the bar. It's got wear on it. It's an 058 gauge chain, which I don't have much of. And I actually found this chain in the junk pile, and it's okay. It looks like it got used. It may have been dirted a little bit, not rocked. So it's not going to cut like either one of those two saws just because of the chain. Plus it's only 60 cc's instead of a full 70. But this is more just to let it warm up, let it cook out the mouse crap and the rat's nest that might be in the muffler, stuff like that. You know the smell, I'm sure you've all done it. And just see if it runs, see if it'll do a couple of cuts and then restart, which tells me that the seals and stuff like that are pretty good. So don't expect the same kind of speed, but hopefully it'll cut, right? Let's see if it'll start. Now this is a firewood day. Yeah, Bob brought two 258, one with an open port, one with a closed port. And I've got my old 61, I've got my 621. And we got a bunch of logs over there that we're going to drag out to here and then break them down like Bob's doing right now. Once you look at this chain here, that's a semi-chisel. And by all rights, if you listen to the online experts, that thing shouldn't even cut a piece of wood. So we're gonna run it and just see whether or not I can actually form a chip with that thing. You know. That's the open port, right?
Yep.
I got through it.
Of course.
I'm gonna see if I can.
It's like all the different 372 cylinders. If the chassis is good, they're usually all good.
Yeah. So I thought I had the oldest saw here. And I think I still do. Being a 1978. This was a Model 61 Rancher. And Bob has a couple of these 268s. I know I got the oldest saw here. That one. But then he pulls out this thing right here. It's 162. And
81.
1981 is when that was made. And I'm not quite sure what the precursor is. That a 61 with a little closed port cylinder or something?
It's the 630 Super top end.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The same top end. It went all the way through on Jonsered until they stopped making the chassis in 97.
So the 630 and the 162, how does that relate to the 266?
These are, well, this is 48 millimeter. The 266 went up to 50 millimeter.
Okay.
Which is what the 268s are. This is like the Pro version that came out alongside the white tops like yours. And that is stock, as it will remain. Not gonna, I mean, you can't even find a lot of the parts on this thing. So, you know me, every saw doesn't need to be ported. And I don't like hacking on stuff that you can't replace.
Yeah, that's a nice saw. Yeah, the point I was making to some of the guys on one of the Facebook sites about the 266, they're great saws. They didn't realize this was a 48 and they had gone up to 50. I didn't know that. But they still have that small intake block, right? And then the 268, was that the first saw that had the larger intake block?
Yeah, the ports were larger too, inside.
So, all things being equal, a 268 should be a stronger saw to start out with than a 266, right?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, they didn't redesign it to put out less power. So, but some people think, and I don't disagree with this, like the original chassis maybe handles a little bit better. That thing, that 268, that XP ran really strong today.
And that was
over here next to yours.
Yeah, some of this nuance. I mean, there were so many different versions of these things. I mean, over the years. You know, and Bob was pointing out that this was a Rancher, which is not a professional saw. But here it is. I mean, 78, 88, 98, 2008, 2018. You know, 45 years later, there it is. So it may not have been a pro saw, but it obviously was a solid saw. And I guess there was different versions of 268. You had, did the open port have an XP designation, or was that not a XP?
Nope. No, it didn't. And then, did I bring it up to the truck? You know, the open port, you can always kind of tell because the open port 268 came out when the 272 came out. There's another saw on the chassis. And it kind of replaced the 66, which is a whole other story. Which would be better to tell when we've actually got one here, and I do have one. But the XP's all got the small decal, whereas
this one here, that's got
the regular 268, and it won't say XP on it, has the large decal like a 272, and they take a different starter pulley.
See, the only person on the planet that's going to know that nuance is you. To throw out the different starter pulley.
The 3-ring pulley or the 5-ring pulleys. All right, this is the filter that I'm at.
Yeah, well, there's a source of the other filters.
Yeah.
They're Chicons, but they work.
The thing is, people gripe about this. I get it in part, but the filter that's in here is the same filter that's in the original low top 394 and in the 262 XP.
Okay.
And people kind of gripe about. I get it because these things, when they fall out, they're a pain in the ass and you can lose them. But this is actually a really, really, really good seal, good filter system. And there's 4 of these. There's the black one, the yellow one, the orange one, and the flock. I'm serious.
Okay.
So, I mean, but this seal's it's a really tight seal. It's probably, better. But everybody likes that other style filter. that came on the later 272s because it looks like it belongs in your Mustang or something. But this is actually a good system as long as you don't lose the clips. And it sucks when one of them comes out because you got to take the whole, you got to lift the whole thing. It's a pain in the ass. But it's a good filter system.
Yeah. Well, that thing ran good today.
This thing ran really good. I was happy with this. Oh, the things up there. That's why I put in the screws. This, I don't know if Rick Hines, if you're watching this. Rick, this is the one you gave me when you brought it up to the store. It came out pretty good. Usually when I run stuff in this chassis, it always ends up being a 266 or one of the red ones. Like last time up here I had the 670. And I've been saying, I got to get these 268s and drag them out. So today I brought two of them.
Well, I think what we're going to do today is I'm just going to block all this stuff up. And I think I don't know, if we have more energy, we'll go get some more.
It'll be an impressive pile of wood until you realize how much time it took us to put it there. If you said, yeah, we did that about an hour and 20 minutes, wow, you guys really kicked ass. But then it's sort of like, well, we did that in about 5 hours, 6 hours, bullshitting.
Well, the goal wasn't being productive. I told you the morning, I said, we either are going to sort of pick our way through it and have fun with it, or we'll be production mode. You started out by saying, hey, you know, I'm kind of wanting to get stuff done, and now it's like, okay, we're good.
Well, we got to burn a little calories off.
Yeah.
I'm getting fat.
Oh, I'm already fat. That was there to start with. So I think I'm going to run Jonsereds today for the rest of the day.
I'm doing up to the 162.
Yeah. All right.